Since the first Quad Leaders Summit in 2021, the grouping has grown by leaps and bounds, with several new areas of cooperation, and emerging tech, of course, is prime among them. Some of these new areas have had practical, concrete outcomes. The 5G working group, for example, recently resulted in a cooperative agreement with Palau for an Open RAN-led 5G rollout. Some perhaps are more aspirational, and the quantum work, for example, is one of those emergent areas. Now we'll jump right into the discussion because we have a very short period of time to actually do some of this, because we also want to give an opportunity to all of you to get your questions in as well. So starting with an opening question to all of you. In light of the progress that the Quad has made, is it time now for the Quad to have a secretariat? And can we really scale some of the outcomes without a secretariat? I'll turn to the speaker to my right first. Arvind.
Two very quick responses to that. A formal secretariat helps in just having a coordinating body, and if that can be done, a body that is a static body or a group of people who are there on a constant basis, it can be achieved without. I mean, that is a virtual secretariat. So yes, I think the answer is yes. That is required to keep the agenda moving forward and keeping, if I may use the word, the projects truthful and on time. But there is the real meat and the real significance of all the discussions is in all different levels of cooperation that is there, whether it's research, academics, industry, security and others. So as long as that is happening, I think a semi-formal structure, coordination structure is important.
I like your use of the term semi-formal. I think that still leaves some room for interpretation. Mr. Agram, I know you have a different perspective on this. How would you respond?
Thank you. So there are, a number of international organizations. We also have a number of loose groupings, both plurilateral and minilateral. UN, Commonwealth, NAM, BRICS, G20, and Quad. So some of them have secretariats, some of them don't have secretariats. So how do you want to drive the process? You want it to be a secretariat-driven process, or you want it to be a members-driven process? So I think Quad is at a very sweet spot where, we have enough collaboration. We are small enough in numbers to actually coordinate better and keep it a member-driven process. And it's not so large and so unwieldy where you need a secretariat, because if a need would have been felt, I am sure we would have moved in that direction. So I think we are at a sweet spot now.
There's definitely appetite for deeper cooperation. Since there isn't an American on the panel, I'm forced to take the American perspective. But there was a proposal in Congress recently for a Quad-level intra-parliamentary working group, which we'll see where that heads, but there's that appetite certainly. Miho-san, how would you respond? And you can respond from the cybersecurity perspective specifically.
Sure. So I'd like to answer your question about how to scale our collaboration on cybersecurity. So I think that the Quad members can take two approaches to scale our initiatives. So the two ways is train of trainers, and the second was the visuality. So even though that we have a limited number of membership, Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, but still we have lots of populations to reach out to. And one of the priorities for cybersecurity is how to raise awareness. Because right now, the 10% of the global GDP is lost due to cyber criminal activities. So that's a huge. So I'd like to share now how Japan is actually doing to do that. So NTT is doing a lot to raising awareness and helping capacity building in ASEAN countries. And what worked really well is training with trainers. So MTT provided training sessions for Vietnam computer emergency response team a few years ago. And the Vietnam government actually provided the same training sessions to Vietnamese critical infrastructure sectors like financial institutions later. So that way they can multiply the effects and also reach out to wider audiences to raise awareness. And the second is visualizations. So one of the reasons why the general public still struggles to understand what cyber attacks means to their daily lives or business operations is because some of the damages caused by cyber attacks are not necessarily visual. So if it's like water leakage, you can see that the water is dripping or there's like all over the water. So you see that, you have to send somebody to fix it. But if you see like, there's an information leakage, you don't necessarily see like the wet floor. So what the Japanese government is doing so far is to use Japanese pop culture, manga or cartoons. So the Japanese, so Tokyo Metropolitan Government publishes manga for free to reach out to small and medium-sized business owners to create really easy to understand cartoon series. And also the Japanese government and always collaborate with really popular cartoon authors to publish advertisement in the Shibuya Scramble. So everybody sees that don't use weak passwords in February because February is the cybersecurity awareness month. Thank you.
And just to add on to that point, Hyo-san, what role do you see the Quad then playing in perhaps amplifying Japan's efforts, including in perhaps Southeast Asia?
So one of the initiatives the Quad is taking is raising awareness. So that is why I introduced two approaches taken by the Japanese, the training with trainers and the visualizations. So that because the Quad members already agreed on that we will do this not only for the Quad member population, but also reach out to the bigger global populations to help the awareness raising and also capacity buildings. So I think that to copy what Japanese they're doing successfully would be useful to duplicate not only amongst the Quad members, but also in ASEAN countries too.
Thank you. Marcus, since we are on the topic of the private sector and how they're navigating this changing cybersecurity landscape, how do you see these trends playing out from your seat in Singapore? And also, of course, responding to the initial question about the need for a secretariat.
Yeah, sure. Look, thanks, Tricia, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I mean, I think this question on a secretariat is interesting because it gets to, what are the strengths of a grouping like the Quad? My view is, I think part of the strengths of the Quad have come from the political momentum and impetus behind the group. It's very clearly been top agenda item for the 4 leaders. There's been that leaders level engagement that's cascaded through the national security communities of each. So I think perhaps just my perspective, more than a secretariat, the question's about how do you take that momentum, that political level interest, and then see, it is the right question, are there the right platforms and mechanisms for collaboration? And that's not going to be static. There'll be new opportunities that come up. And I do think looking at some of the technology and cybersecurity engagement between the 4 nations, I think there are opportunities to possibly explore deeper collaboration with industry in some of that. I think there's more of a role that industry can play. It is the private sector that provides most of the critical digital infrastructure in the 4 countries. So I think looking for some industry roles, and then of course looking at the role that think tanks and others can play as well, I think is great. Maybe just to briefly touch on 2 examples of that. I think if we think about the digital infrastructure collaboration between the Quad, you talked about 5G. I think there's been discussion about cables and sort of some key parts of digital infrastructure. I think there's a real opportunity now to plug some of the gaps in that digital infrastructure conversation and really say, well, look, do we have the right infrastructure for interoperability between those 4 Quad countries? I do think looking at the role that cloud plays in that is critical. And as the Quad's looking at the agenda over the next 6, 12, 18 months, how can there be that shared understanding of security in the cloud? How is there a vision for having industry and government get together and look at what's the alignment in security requirements? Are there high enough security baselines? There's been some good work on software security principles in the Quad, but I think it's now a great opportunity to build on that, get industry in the room, make it more sort of practical to raise those security baselines and have that infrastructure for interoperability. And then I think the other is, as Mihiko was talking about, some of the cyber piece. We know there's been very active cyber collaboration and there's a cyber senior officials dialogue between the 4, but I do think that's an area as well where looking at whether there are opportunities to bring industry more actively into some of that conversation, to do things like threat intelligence sharing between the 4 countries. What's industry seeing as well? Is there the right real-time sharing of information? Are there trends being picked up between the 4? So I think great opportunities to look at new forms of collaboration between the 4 countries. I'm not sure personally that comes through a Secretariat, but I do think there's sort of some interesting platforms to explore on the digital infrastructure for interoperability piece and then looking at cyber as well.
Thank you, Marcus, for touching on several areas that we can expand on through the course of this discussion. Erin, since we have come to the topic of infrastructure, including digital public infrastructure, and looking at new areas of cooperation, one of the new additions to the Quad leaders' statement last year was DPIs. So from your vantage point, how are you seeing this as an area of cooperation within the Quad, and what is needed really now to operationalize this?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tricia. Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, going back to, again, your first question around whether or not there needs to be a Secretariat, though, I just want to make the point that if something's not broken, don't fix it. The Quad has progressed relatively nicely. The big risk is, of course, is that when that political impetus changes, that's actually the biggest risk to the Quad. And we've seen that in other regions as well. Look at Argentina. And BRICS, for example. So I think that's where that's the biggest risk. But if otherwise, things are kind of trundling along quite nicely. In terms of the digital infrastructure and DPIs, I mean, for people in the room here who are familiar with DPIs in India, world leading, world class, right? And I think that digital payments is the next big area that we can be looking at internationally, and it's an area for the Quad to look at in Quad countries. You've already seen Singapore, France, the UAE take up UPI, which is the Unified Payments Interface. Now, it's very limited in its capability because of liquidity, but that is a really significant opportunity for other countries, including the Quad. So UPI is immediate, fast, cheap payments that happen instantly. And I think the limit at the moment is around $2,000 or something with Singapore. It is quite low. But in terms of that opportunity with real collaboration with a country like India, we actually have to be looking at their payment systems. If you think about trying to access the economic opportunity that's here, if our systems aren't able to speak to each other, if we don't have that interoperable system that you mentioned, Marcus, then we can't do that. And not in a way that is really meaningful, so particularly for a country like Australia. So to give you some context now, and at what scale this is happening in India, is 68% of payments in India happen on UPI. 10.6 billion transactions happened on UPI in August 2023 alone last year. This is the way forward in India. So I think that this is an area that Quad can be looking at. It requires multi-stakeholder engagement on the issues. It requires the private sector. It requires government-to-government agreements. It requires central banks. It is complicated, but we've seen it happen in other places. I think Singapore is probably the best example of that at the moment, and this is what we should be looking at in the Quad as well.
Thank you, Erin. Now, I heard somebody say this at a conference recently, nobody's paying you to make standards. A question for the panel, is cooperation within the Quad sharp enough, sustained enough to do that quote unquote unsexy work on actually setting the standards on critical infrastructure, on cloud security issues of that nature? We can start with you, Erin, and then Marcus.
I think I somewhat disagree with the premise that no one's paying for standards, in the sense that, so I guess the way that I sort of think about this is, and having worked in both public policy land and private sector land, is where does this actually have commercial benefit? And that's where you'll start to see people sitting around paying to make standards, right? So I somewhat disagree with the question there. And actually, you know, that intersection between policymakers, between track 2, between the private sector is increasingly important. And we are increasingly seeing that. I mean, Microsoft is sitting at the table here. We're sitting at the table here as well. So it's really important that both sides are a part of that conversation, and that public policy, that standards, all of that is co-designed. And where you find that there is value that can be unlocked, there is money flowing in order to get that work done.
Great, thank you. Sharp answer, Marcus.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think sort of for some of the areas that I talked about before, I think the standards are actually in place in the 4 countries in many ways. If you look at something like the procurement standards that each of the 4 governments have when they're purchasing technology for the government. You know, the United States has the FedRAMP standard, there's equivalents in Japan and Australia and a similar framework in India. So I think the standards are in place. I think where the opportunity is for the Quad is then go that next level down. Have the 4 governments sit down together and say, we've each got a shared vision of what we want the region to look like. We've got a shared vision for securing the digital ecosystem and our digital infrastructure. Let's dig deeper into those standards and say, well, actually, when we look at the level of the individual requirements and controls in those standards, they're 90% the same across the 4 countries. And so how does that then help industry operate more seamlessly across the 4 countries to provide that digital infrastructure for interoperability? How does that give the governments confidence that the right vendors are in place, providing the right kinds of services with the right kind of security requirements in place? So I think the standards are often there. I think where the opportunity is next is really get that next level deeper and see, well, are we stitching them together in the right way across the 4 countries to, you know, have more of that shared, secure digital ecosystem?
Mr. Raghuram, since deeper cooperation at the government level was mentioned.
I agree with Marcus. Couple of announcements have been made in the May 2023 Leaders Declaration. You will see Quad Joint Principles on Critical and Emerging Technologies featured. Also, Quad ISC, an International Standards Cooperation Network, was launched. So the idea is to provide broad principles and guidance to the industry to follow, as he was mentioning, rather than develop a sort of a supranational Quad regulatory body. I don't think that is the direction any one of us wants to go. So the industry is taking the cues from the leadership and the political direction, and that's where we are headed, I think. Yeah.
I heard you agreeing.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that are in place or getting in place in motion, but there is a lot that I want to bring to the table that we need to think about how we can actually tangibilize many of the, as you know, Mr. Raghuram used the word, the industry, the signals coming from the leadership had to be then really tangibilized to actually working items. You know, I'm going to just, you know, the digital public infrastructure, give you a couple of examples. And while there has been intent, but the architecture of DPI in India is very different from the architecture of digital infrastructure anywhere else in the world. We are a bottom-up architecture. It's public-private partnership. It's an ecosystem value creation rather than winner-takes-it-all architecture. Does not produce, you know, just a few big ones. It, you know, make sure that the society benefits in general. And that itself presents a big challenge when it comes to the business models around digital public infrastructure and agreements on that. So, and you know, we've come a long way. What has helped in coming a long way? This room did not agree on digital public infrastructure 3 years ago at the same Raisina. Today, it is started to agree. and I'm glad that it has started to agree. The second thing about standards, I think that we have standards in place, but a lot has to be done in that. Interoperability is coming into play, but payments interoperability, while it's so easy with UPI, and Erin would know this, and everybody else in this room, it really doesn't exist beyond that, because from a business perspective, it is money has been made in operating in their own closed networks. So a lot needs to be done in creating translating the signals coming from the political leadership, the country leadership, into actual partnerships with both public and private enterprises, and seeing the larger value that is being created rather than a value for the few. I'll give two examples, and then we can open it up for discussion. One is, we're talking about threat intelligence. Now, taking it further to one of the core things of AI, ML, part of the critical and emerging technologies stream also, is do we look at creating large common trusted data rooms, that data across the world, because that's another thing from a quad perspective that we have to look at. Can we create common computing power? You see, computing power again has a skew towards one of the hyperscalers, which are coming from one region of one partner of the quad. The three other regions actually starve of doing getting the compute power to do a lot of research, to do actual work. So there has to be more operationalizing things which are enabling the signals that are coming from the top leadership. As I said, within the DPIs, actually making sure that business models make sense for everybody. There is trust in that thing. To in areas like AI and ML, which requires a lot of data governance. India has a model of DPIs, and can we but add on to the compute power, which is the shared computing power across the world, and that's going to be, and as all of you know, that's really becoming the most expensive resource in doing, whether it's cybersecurity or any large scale research and implementation. And third is how not just going beyond the threat intelligence, but when we go forward, can we create a lot of common data rooms, which are hosted in the cloud again, because that will bring standards and interoperability, and can be shared across the quad countries and the networks that the quad countries want to do. And lastly, I think there has been a lot of thinking on how we ensure non-weaponization of AI, and a lot of work has been done and should be carried forward a lot.
So the good news about cybersecurity is everybody is interested. Nobody denies in the 21st century cybersecurity is not important anymore. And because the Quad member countries and also any countries on this planet are so much more dependent on the digitized market. So including the financial sectors and AI and cloud and everything is dependent on these digitized technologies. So that is why cybersecurity is an underpin for everything. So because the Quad members covers a diversified agenda, but everything has to be mindful about cybersecurity. So I think it will be challenging, but also the opportunities for the Quad members, because now we have the opportunities to make sure that to put cybersecurity up front in the beginning of the discussions. So to make sure how to secure digitized infrastructure, as Marcus pointed out, we have to make sure that we have to make sure that the cybersecurity is embedded in the whole ecosystems. So secure by design, cyber threat intelligence sharing to mitigate potential cyber attack damages, and also but we will still see some damages caused by cyber attacks anyway. So we have to be realistic. So we have to collaborate together to how to disrupt or crack down cyber attacker activities.
Thank you. So I'm seeing some spaces in which the private sector now has to start responding to signals from the leadership level, but now I'm also hearing from the panel that that the private sector has most of it figured out and is now waiting for some of it to be operationalized at the government level. So there seems to be some disconnect in a few of these areas. We are now almost at time for questions. So now that we're at that point in the discussion, we can start talking about the Quad Leaders Summit that New Delhi will be hosting sometime later this year. The dates haven't been announced. What would be on your wish list for that summit? What are some concrete outcomes you'd hope to see coming out of those meetings? We can also use this as the point where you've all raised some issues that you would want to see addressed at various levels. How would you want to respond to these questions? Erin, we can start with you and then move down.
I think it might be a little bit obvious what I might say. Some ambition around digital economy would be a big one for me. I think that what would be really interesting, right, if Quad countries or, and this goes beyond the Quad as well, were to adopt and utilise Indian technology would be a really, it'd be quite significant. So for me, that's the area that I'd like to see progressed through DPI and UPI in particular. The second thing that I would like to see is that it must be noted that the only country in the Quad that Taylor Swift has not visited is actually India. So on that statement, if they could be advocating for her to come here, that would be fantastic.
This is the second time this week I've seen Taylor Swift mentioned in the context of geopolitics. There's recently an issue with Southeast Asia and Taylor going to one country and not another.
There was an agreement not to go to Thailand. Yes. It's terrible.
Mr. Raghuram.
So, if we look back at the history of the short history of the summits, all of them have been very substantive, and each one has scaled up in ambition and the outcomes that have come out. So we are working on more than 24 tracks to come up with substantive outcomes for the Quad Summit. Tomorrow, in fact, with ORF, we are going to launch a Quad think tank forum to generate more ideas from think tank community, from industry, from everybody who is invested in this quadrilateral relationship that we have, and I'm fairly confident that we will have good outcomes.
Thank you also for the pitch for the forum tomorrow, and I'm sure a lot of us will be there as well.
So I'd like to just piggyback what you just said. So at least for the cybersecurity sessions or the how to secure digital infrastructure session, we should invite industry representatives, because industry is a source of innovation. Industry is a source of economic power. Industry is a source of technologies. So if they are not there to share their perspectives, then it will be impossible for the government to implement their policies or strategies. So that's why I think that the industry should be there.
Marcus.
Look, I mean, I do think the summit is going to be a fantastic opportunity for Indian leadership in the Quad, and not that India hasn't provided leadership, all of the 4 countries have. I think, the 24 tracks that Mr. Raghuram mentioned, I wouldn't add another track. I'm not sure it's about that. I think it's about, what opportunity does this present to really harvest more concrete progress in some of these areas in new ways? I love the example of the software security principles from May 2023. This gives an opportunity to say, well, what tangible progress have we made? How has industry responded to those signals? What more does industry need? I think have that dialogue. And so thinking about, in the lead up to the summit, a set of opportunities to engage with industry, with the think tank community and others in the lead up to that, to really start harvesting some of those ideas to make, demonstrate the tangible progress that the grouping's made.
Thank you, Marcus. And hopefully you're at the Quad forum tomorrow as well. Arvind.
Yeah, I think Erin has already talked about the DPI, so that definitely, I think we need to press upon that. And the other area, I think, and which I alluded to in my remarks, was a lot more work for the leaders to talk about cooperation in deep tech also. going into research, into use cases, and then bringing this Quad investment forum, the investment together, because a lot of money is required to be used in different regions to really create more success stories in deep technology. So I would say, apart from DPIs in the digital economy, look at deep tech as research, use cases, and investment.
Right, thanks all of you. We have an astounding 20 minutes for questions. So are there any questions from the audience? There's a roving mic, so please, yes, at the back.
Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for the fascinating conversation. I'm Mariko Togashi from Japan, one of the Raisina Young Fellows. I'd like to ask about further about keeping the momentum of the private sector. I guess on top of the topics already discussed, the Quad Investors Network was one of the big developments. So how effective is the current government platform initiatives to increase the private sector collaboration and mutual investments? And I guess the key was the presence, operationalization, and deeper conversation at the government level. But is there anything else like further that government can take action? Thank you.
And there was one question at the back, the gentleman in the suit.
Thank you. I'm Ashirwad Dwivedi. I'm one of the Raisina Fellow. I teach at Delhi University. Taking clue from Taylor Swift, my question is, the current international transaction based on SWIFT is very slow, it's opaque, and it's very costly. Shouldn't Quad try a pilot based on CBDC, or maybe taking clue from UPI, which will provide an alternative to SWIFT-based international transaction? Thank you.
Tough question. If there's another question, we can take three of them together, otherwise. Okay. All right. So, question on.
Trisha, I think
Yeah. Hello. I was also wondering, so two things. First of all, about the role of the private sector. I was wondering how seriously, the private sector is seeing the Quad as a relevant space of operations. And second, I was wondering about the possible, I would say interactions or synergies between the Quad and the Indo-Pacific economic framework that is being negotiated. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. All right, so three questions, mostly relating to financial infrastructure and financial connectivity. The first is the government helping maintain the momentum of that's being generated by the private sector, which goes back to a couple of points made by the speakers. The second, alternatives to SWIFT, including CBDCs. And the third, how seriously is the private sector taken in these conversations, and progress on IPEF? We can start with Mr. Raghuram. How seriously are you taking the private sector?
So I think Marcus would be better to answer this, but anyway.
Both sides are required.
So especially in IT and in fact many other sectors, including new and emerging technologies, there are a lot of multinationals. They have their origins in various regulatory environments. They are in Japan, they are in US, they are in India and Australia, obviously. So they are responding to these regulatory frameworks also, even as they are responding to evolving Quad environment. So I think it's fairly accurate to say that it's early days to say that industry and private sector is not being involved. So the idea, as I said, is this complexity is very well recognized, and they all have sort of a conflict, if I am correct, Marcus would tell here, between taking the high principles of what Quad should do, and each one of them will also be pursuing their bottom lines, what is good for their bottom lines, what should they be doing. So there is a bit of a complexity there, and it will take some time before, you will see the emergence of the private sector as a more actively leading on some of these ideas that we are currently discussing at political level, at official level, in the Quad format. What do you, Marcus?
Thanks. No, I mean, I think it's a fascinating question. I do think, I won't speak for the whole of the private sector. It's a little bit, too big. But I mean, I just think in terms of the Microsoft perspective, look, I mean, we absolutely take the Quad seriously. I think we take all of these regional groupings, whether they're bilateral or larger groups of countries, seriously. I think what's important for us, though, is what is that set of directions we're getting from government? And then what's the power that government has to set regulatory policy standards, frameworks to support, so we can do our job to support the objectives of the Quad countries. And just, a couple of the objectives that we've touched on in the discussion so far: securing the digital ecosystem, top level political priority, but it's a top level priority for industry as well. I mean, it's absolutely in our commercial interest to do that. It's in the interest of the wider economy to be strengthening cybersecurity defences, to be using AI more for cyber defence, to be moving critical infrastructure to the cloud where it benefits from AI, data, ML capabilities. So I think there is that alignment of interest. And then I think it's about sort of government and industry being in the same room, those signals being interpreted clearly, getting the feedback loops going so that industry can say to government, look, we hear you. Here's the next thing that we think would be helpful to, kind of keep us moving in the same direction. So I think both take each other very seriously, and then it's about getting those practical mechanisms in place.
So we're in the courtship phase, essentially. Arvind.
I just want to add to what Marcus said and what Mr. Raghuram said. I think the private sector, and I don't carry a brief for the private sector, but my advice for the private sector is to take all these signals very seriously. There could be opportunities, but there could be threats also. And if they don't take it seriously, they could be, they are overlooking certain things that could disrupt their businesses going forward. So clearly it has happened in the past, and it can happen a lot more, especially when DPIs get more universal and more accepted.
A warning from Arvind. Aaron, would you like to respond to this question and also any of the others?
It's not a warning, it's advice. They need to think about it seriously. They shouldn't take it lightly.
So I'll take a slightly different angle on this. What I can kind of compare it with is ASEAN in Australia. So this is from an Australian perspective, looking up at the Quad or at ASEAN, is that the way that the business community engages in the ASEAN space is more sophisticated and more developed, and it's been around a lot longer as well. And I think that the Quad as a concept for the business community is kind of new, because really it started as a security dialogue, and then we realised it was moving away in a new direction. So it's actually a relatively new format for the business community to engage with. So we have, I think it's the 50th Australia ASEAN Summit or something coming up in a few, I should know that, in a few weeks in Australia. And there is a CEO forum. It's heavily engaged with the business community. There is a SME summit. There was the last one in 2018 as well. So what I'm saying there is the business community is much more engaged with ASEAN as a grouping in a way that they're not with Quad. Having said that, again, from the Australian perspective, if you look bilaterally within the Quad, the US is our largest economic partner when you factor in both trade and investment. India, we are obviously developing our trade partnership through ECTA, and that's really developing, particularly for some sectors. Japan is our second largest trading partner. So if you think about it that way, the Quad's already kind of arrived from a business perspective. So I kind of like, does the private sector need to engage in the Quad in a different way or a new way? It's a really good question. But what we'll do in our roles, so I'm in a consultancy, so when we're looking, and we specialise in public policies, when we're looking at what these developments are, we're definitely looking for opportunities for our clients to be engaging in whatever these announcements are that are coming through, whether that's some kind of investment opportunity or similar. So I think it's actually quite developed, and I think if you look at the economic relationships within the Quad bilaterally, it's kind of a similar story.
Sure. So I think the industry is taking the signals from the government really seriously, and we really appreciate, and we actually actively engage with various governments to have behind-the-scene conversations to try to understand why the government wants to put out these new standards or regulations or policies beforehand, so that we can put practical inputs, so that the government can understand what's going on in the threat landscape and in terms of cybersecurity, and also where the market or technology is going forward, so that we can collaborate to see that better and also more practical and effective strategy and the policy will be born from the government. And I think that and also that there's momentum, at least in Japan, I see more informal conversations going on between the government and the industry these days, especially about cybersecurity. And I'm really grateful for the Japanese government, because every single cybersecurity policy committee by various Japanese ministries and agencies consists of 50% academia, 50% industry. Always 50% industry. So then the government, well, I do not necessarily say that the government always include every single input from the industry into their policy or regulations, but at least they're willing to listen to the both good and bad, and trying to incorporate as much as they can to help not only the Japanese but also for the international cybersecurity community.
Would anybody like to take the question on the Quad building an alternative financial infrastructure?
If I can again, on the question of cybersecurity and approach to security in general on IT-related issues, one of the things we should not underestimate is when Quad countries arrive at these principles. For example, it is International Standards Cooperation Network or software security principles. They also reflect national consensus within each of our countries, and we take this approach to other international forum. When we go to UN, when we go to Intergovernmental Working Group on Internet Governance, when we go to International Telecom Union, we are all taking these approaches and our principles, agreed principles, to those organizations as well. And each of us are taking these principles and these agreed consensus approaches to our bilateral relationships as well outside Quad. So there is a large spillover effect of what Quad does as a cohort also happening elsewhere. And we shouldn't overlook that as well. And it will be felt gradually, I think. It will, because it's all new. It may not be very evident, but in the couple of years from now, you will see the spillover effects of these things happening elsewhere also.
Yes, great point on Quad serving essentially as a springboard for the individual countries going out and pitching these ideas at international forums. Erwin.
So I'm just going to shift to two other points that were in the question. Two other questions that were raised. One is on the investment side. India is a great beneficiary of both investments coming into infrastructure and startup ecosystem of India, primarily from Japan and US. 45% of our investments overall are coming from these two pools. So I think there is a need for pooling, and I have already mentioned, but specifically into semiconductors, minerals, and green tech, and that is the Quad investment network, or whatever shape and form it takes. But those are the new areas that the investment should be coming in and collaborating in ensuring common solutions. And if you want the contentious issue of SWIFT, I can answer that. I think it's not only a Quad ask. It's been an ask. It's been an issue, I must say, being discussed at other multilateral forums also. So whether somebody said if something is not broken, don't fix it. So for SWIFT, that is not the case in my opinion. SWIFT, whatever happens, but we could find a new, more efficient way of working for international money movement. And whether CBDC is the only answer or any other more efficient way of creating the right standards and messaging systems, I think should be looked at. And as I said, Quad is one of the bodies that has that you could raise it, but there are other multilateral organizations that have also raised interest in solving for this. So the person who asked this question, I'm not sure whether CBDC is the only way to go, but there could be other ways to do it.
Right. We have time for a couple of more questions.
Hi, my name is Albert from Australia at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I want to go back to Taylor Swift actually, and I think of like the Quad countries as almost like sort of like the four central, cultural centers of the world. So India has Bollywood, Japan has manga and sort of whole history. America has Taylor Swift. Australia has its wombats and speeches kind of thing. So I sort of like highlight there are opportunities for cooperation around sort of. You can give us soft power, but like people-to-people links doing the Quad to sort of, advocate for a more artistic, creative sort of world.
So we just have 3 minutes, so we'll just take that question. My apologies to the rest of the audience. You can always approach the speakers after they've eaten. Yes.
Hi, Albert from Australia. Really good question because, in a sense, some of that people-to-people stuff's already happening. And I did find it interesting a couple of years ago on the Australian side where all of a sudden, the new Young Leaders Summits were like Quad Young Leaders things and stuff, which was really significant. And I think that the cultural piece, though, is one that needs to be added into these things. You do see that in more developed relationships. So if you look at the Australia-India relationship, there's a lot more cultural stuff that's going on there. If you look at Australia-ASEAN, there's a lot more cultural integration there into the various public diplomacy programs and so on. Whereas that actually is a really big opportunity. And you're right, like the soft power of the countries in the Quad is phenomenal. But that's definitely something. Is someone from the government in the room listening? There you go. Because that is actually a really significant opportunity.
Marcus?
I'm never going to say no to more cultural exchange, especially if wombats are involved. But I mean, I think it's just one of the challenges for any of these groups, whether it's Quad or anything else, is that I think there are always benefits and opportunities in continuing to expand the agenda, but it sometimes comes at a risk of losing sight of some of the original objectives. And I wouldn't speak for the governments involved, obviously, but I think sort of as an observer, really a shared set of concerns about security in the region were the motivation behind the reinvigoration of the Quad a few years ago and, its kind of elevation to a leaders level dialogue. I think ensuring that if the agenda builds sort of a whole lot of other issues in, that it doesn't lose sight of ways of making that tangible progress on, a shared sense of securing the region and the role that the four countries play. But I love the point from Mr. Raghuram about it's not just the four, it's the four with the rest of the region and even the world as well, with a shared sense of values and practices. So I think great to add other issues in, but I think just ensuring that there's that constant progress on the original agenda is incredibly important.
Thank you for grounding us. The conclusion we're taking from this is that Taylor Swift needs to be the Quad ambassador now.
Yes.
Right. Thank you all of you for your great inputs. Thanks all of you for being so engaged. We can now eat. Thank you.
But